Okay, so let me start. Okay, so I have titled this talk Reconstructing the Development Discourse, Bringing Production Back In. As Nicolas just said, I have edited a special issue of the journal European Journal of Development Research, in which some of the lectures for APORDE have contributed, basically trying to kind of bring back production into the discussion about economic development. I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. And this talk is partly based on what I did there in 3 co-authored articles, as well as the introduction. But there's other stuff, so it's not as if I'm presenting that special issue. Yeah, let's kind of take it a bit easy in the beginning and talk about production in a more kind of intuitive way. Oh, why is it not? This man once famously said that the problem with the French is that they don't have the word for entrepreneurship. Okay, I mean that he didn't quite get his French right, but he was a busy man. He had to invade Iraq, worry about North Korea, arrange some juicy construction contracts for his vice president, Dick Cheney. Do some avant-garde experiments with English grammar. He was a busy man. He had a lot on his plate. So he is excused for not updating his French, but his remark actually reflects a fairly common Anglo-American prejudice against the French as a country that is full of laid-back people, is relaxed about making money, undynamic, full of meddling bureaucrats, pompous waiters, and time-wasting pseudo-intellectuals. So this is a picture from the 19th century, the famous painter Renoir. This is the kind of image that many Anglo-American people have of France. Now, I will show you evidence that this conception of France is actually very wrong. But before we get to that, I would like to argue that the perspective behind his statement is actually quite widely accepted. I mean, you may not talk about a particular country like France or whatever, but that it is fairly commonly accepted that you need entrepreneurial people to have a successful economy. So in this view, the poverty of developing countries is attributed to the lack of entrepreneurship. So when people from rich countries go to a developing country and come across a scene like this, they say, aha, I know why this country is poor. Look at all these men sitting around in this cafe, having their 11th cup of mint tea of the day and smoking their hookahs away. This country needs more wheelers and dealers, movers and shakers, people who go out, do business deals, make money, and that's the only way they can pull themselves out of poverty. So in this perspective, the poverty of developing countries is explained by the lack of entrepreneurs. Of course, anyone who is from or has lived for a period in a developing country, i.e. most of the people in this seminar, know that these are more typical scenes in developing countries. Thousands and millions of people trying to sell everything that can be sold, and indeed things that you never knew could be sold. When I was a young man in the 1980s, when it was very difficult for the South Koreans, I'm from South Korea, to get a visa to go to the United States. And this was a time before, the internet. This was even time before those annoying answering machine system that the Americans have invented, making you wait on the phone line for tens of minutes. So the only way to get an interview with the American embassy for your visa was to line up in front of the American embassy. And this prompted some enterprising Koreans to become what I can only call professional queuers. Yeah? So they wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, go and line up in front of the American embassy. Come 8:45, some guy in a sharp suit turns up and approaches you and says, "Hey, that spot you are standing looks very nice. Would you mind selling it to me?" And you say, "Oh, no, I have to go to America. My uncles are very sick. I have to go and see him there." And the guy says, "Oh, I'll give you that $200 or whatever." And you say, no, my uncle was like father to me. I have to go. And then the guy says, "I'll give you $400. And then you say, "Okay, my uncle can die. Take my place." So they actually sold the spots in the queue. I mean, another example like that, when in one of my earlier visits to South Africa, a friend of mine took me to this the restaurant, and he parked the car in front of the restaurant, and suddenly this guy turned up from out of nowhere and told my friend, "Oh, I'll watch your car while you are eating." And my friend forked out, I don't know, whatever it was, like 20 rands at 30 rands or whatever, and gave it to this guy. And I asked my friend, "What are you doing? I mean, watching your car? I mean, there's nothing to watch." And my friend said, no, Ha-Joon, you have to understand what it means is that if you don't pay me, I'll slash your tires while you're eating. The guy actually invented a job, yeah, of watching, quote unquote, cars, yeah. An Indonesian friend of mine told me that when the Jakarta city government introduced carpool lane in the roads, it created this new profession of, well, I mean, they don't have official name, but carpoolers, meaning that, if the carpool rule is that you need to have at least 3 people in the vehicle to be able to travel on the quicker, emptier carpool lane, you basically the stand around at the beginning of the carpool lane, and then some guy in the Toyota Land Cruiser will stop and say, "I need 2 people to be able to travel in the carpool lane." You get in, the guy that travels fast, you get paid, I don't know, $5 or whatever, and then everyone's happy. Yeah? I mean, I could go on and on with this kind of examples, and I'm sure most of you can think of at least 1 or 2 interesting examples from your own country. But developing countries are full of entrepreneurs, yeah? People buying and selling things all the time, but inventing things to sell, selling things that people from rich countries would never even imagine that is saleable. Yeah? In contrast, most citizens in the rich countries have not even come near to becoming an entrepreneur. They mostly work for a company, some of them employing tens of thousands or even millions of people, doing highly specialized jobs, in the process realizing someone else's entrepreneurial vision. I remember that when I was a graduate student, that reading in the late 1980s, reading that there was this engineer in General Motors whose job was to design door handles. It wasn't even a door. It was the door handle. So it can be that specialized. And yeah, most people work in jobs like that. And they are not engaged in any type of entrepreneurial activity. You can see it from the numbers. If you count the proportion of self-employed people in the total working population, only about 1 in 8 people in the rich countries are self-employed. The proportion could be as high as 90%, because if you count self-employed farmers, it could be very high depending on the country. And the average for poor countries is between 30 to 50%. I mean, these numbers are more difficult to estimate than than the numbers in the rich countries. But at least 30%, probably 50%, and 60, 70, 80% of the people are self-employed. Whereas in the rich countries is that on average 1 in 8, in some countries it's even lower. Norway is the lowest, 6.7%, US 7.5%, France 8.6%. So actually, George W. Bush, or W's comment, was a classic case of the pot calling the kettle black. The president of the second least entrepreneurial country in the world called the third least entrepreneurial country in the world, France, a country that lacks in entrepreneurship, when his own country was actually less entrepreneurial, in the sense that a lower portion of people were working for themselves. So roughly speaking, the chance of someone in a poor country being an entrepreneur is 2 to 4 times higher than the same chance for someone from a rich country. The ratio could be more than 10 times, depending on which countries you pick. So we have a puzzle here, because if people in developing countries are so much more entrepreneurial than their rich country counterparts, why are they so poor? The most popular answer to this in the last couple of decades has been that poor people in developed countries lack credits. They are willing to be an entrepreneur, but being an entrepreneur that requires that at least some money. But being poor, they cannot get access to credit. And if you give them credit, they'll be able to engage in entrepreneurial activities and pull themselves up out of poverty. And this thinking is, as you would have already guessed, what is behind this celebrated microfinance movement. Basically, lending small sums of money to poor people so that they can use it to start business and stand on their own feet. Now, microfinance became so popular, especially in the first decade of 2000s, that in 2006, the Grameen Bank and its founder, Dr. Muhammad Yunus, was even given the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, in the last decade or so, increasing evidence has come out that shows that the spread of microfinance has done the little to lift people out of poverty. In some cases, it has made people even worse off. There are many different reasons behind this. I mean, one of them is the excessively high rates of interest rate charged on the borrowers. Unless they are subsidized by the foreign donors and so on, most the microfinance institutions charge 40 to 50% annual rate. There are essentially glorified the loan sharks posing as microfinance institutions, charging 100%, even 200% interest rate, and with that kind of the interest rate, who can make money? Yeah? I mean, there are many other reasons, but one key reason, or rather the key reason for me, is the low productive capabilities of the individuals taking on the loans. Now, let me explain this a bit with an example from the Grameen Bank. You know, in 1997, the Grameen Bank teamed up with the Norwegian state-owned phone company Telenor and gave out microloans to women in rural areas to buy a mobile phone and rent it out. Initially, these telephone ladies made handsome profits. It was estimated that they were making between $750 and $1,200 per year. And at the time, Bangladesh's annual per capita income was around $300. So they were making money that was at least 2.5 times, potentially 4 times the national average income. But this business, unfortunately, that for many people who were engaged in it, became so popular that there were so many telephone ladies that their income fell to around $70 per year by 2005. And in the meantime, Bangladesh's average income has had risen to about $450. So at that point, these telephone ladies were making only about 15% of national income, when earlier, when there were relatively few of them, they could be making up to 4 times the national income. Now, this problem of overcrowding of the market, of course, would not have existed if new business lines could be constantly developed. So, for example, if phone renting becomes less profitable, you could maintain your level of income by manufacturing mobile phones or writing the software for mobile phone games. Now, you will have, of course, that immediately notice the absurdity of these suggestions. The telephone ladies of Bangladesh simply do not have the capabilities to move into phone manufacturing or software design. So they end up crowding these lower end easy businesses when they are given credit. Cambodia is another country where there has been a boom in the microcredit. And yeah, I don't know what the situation is like there with COVID-19 and so on, but until recently, people used to joke that in the Phnom Penh, the capital city of Cambodia, there are more people selling noodles on the street than the people who can eat noodles. Yeah? Because there's a kind of semi-educated, middle-aged woman in a poor country, how many businesses are there for you to start, even if you are given a loan. Yeah, maybe you can weave baskets and sell them. Maybe you can cook noodles on the street and sell them. But there are not many options there. Anyway, I cannot go into the issue of microfinance any deeper, but if you're interested in this, you can look at chapter 15 of this book of mine. It's getting a bit dated now, published in 2010, where I discussed this issue. I mean, I've told you this short story about microfinance because it's very symptomatic of the current state of development discourse, rather than because of its own inherent importance. Until the 1970s, there was a general consensus that economic development is essentially about transformation of the abilities to produce or productive capabilities, in short. Of course, there was a fierce debate on how to achieve it. Some people said that you should engage in the free trade, free market policies. Others that argued for various types of public policy intervention, but there's no disagreement that transforming our country's productive capabilities and productive structure was at the heart of development. But during the last 3 decades, the dominant, most of us still hold such a view of development at the instinctive level. In refusing to describe oil-rich, high-income countries as economically developed, we are implicitly saying that achieving high income through resource bonanza is not synonymous with economic development. At the other end of the spectrum, following the Second World War, the German economy was devastated. The German income level fell to that of Peru or Mexico, but few people at that time argued, and even today would not have argued, that Germany at that time should have been reclassified as a developing country, because we know that Germany still had the necessary productive capabilities to regain its pre-war level of living standard, which it did in about 10 years. I mean, of course, that if too many Germans were killed, probably they would have lost that ability, but they still had those capabilities, individuals, firms, various institutions. So Germany was able to rebuild this the economy very quickly. And in not proposing that Germany at the time should have been classified as a developing country, we are implicitly saying that economic development is about the ability to produce rather than about simple income or, more broadly, command over resources. Unfortunately, during the last 3 decades, the dominant view has changed. The dominant view has become that economic development is basically about poverty reduction and a more widespread provision of basic needs, as illustrated in the so-called MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, adopted by the United Nations in 2000 and defined global development effort until 2015. As you can see, there's virtually nothing on production in the Millennium Development Goals. I mean, you could really stretch it and say that global partnership for development between the rich and the poor countries includes the kind of encouragement of international trade and investment. But I mean, that's kind of really stretching it. because the global partnership was more about the foreign aid and so on. Fortunately, after 2015, we have transitioned to SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which include a couple of items on production. Goal 8 is decent work and economic growth. Goal 9 is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. But the centrality of production in development is still not recognized. These are not even the goals number 3 and 5. I mean, they are 8 and 9, and they are just 2 of 17. So what has happened? I mean, why did development, which is seen as basically originating, if not confined to the sphere of production, why has it become a thing about poverty reduction and basic needs? I would argue that behind this radical transformation in our discourse on economic development in the last 3-4 decades have been 3 intellectual trends. The first is neoliberalism. You know what it is. The second is the humanist discourse represented by the works of Amartya Sen. And the third is the discourse of post-industrial knowledge economy. I'll go through them one by one. So these are the 3 intellectual trends which have dominated our thinking on economic development and the global economy, have led us to neglect production. So first of all, the rise of neoliberalism since the 1980s has made it sure that economic discourse is about market exchange and has little to say about the production, because it is based on, although not synonymous with neoclassical economics. Now, some people confuse neoliberalism and neoclassical economics. These two are not the same. Neoliberalism is the kind of intellectual system that uses neoclassical economics to justify liberal policies. Liberal not in the sense of the United States, but in the sense of 19th century classical liberalism. The small government, no restrictions on the cross-border flows of the goods, capital, and in some version at least, and labor. And the neoliberalism is trying to justify those policies using the tools of neoclassical economics. But not all neoclassical economists are neoliberals, because there are people like Joe Stiglitz, Danny Roderick, who use tools of neoclassical economics in order to justify government intervention. Neoclassical economics is about exchange, market exchange, and that naturally means that production is almost entirely neglected. Of course, there is something called production function, but it is a very mechanical kind of quantitative functional relationship. It defines the quantitative the ratios of this homogeneous capital, the input called capital, and homogeneous input called labor, and somehow they are combined in some proportion and they produce a certain amount of output. Yeah? There's no notion of there having to be the abilities to combine very different types of capital, very different types of labor, imposing labor discipline, the creating cooperative relationships between different groups of workers, between the employers, the managers and the workers, and I cannot go into that, but I'll talk about that more later. Production is missing so much in the neoclassical economics that the 1992 winner of Nobel Economics Prize, Ronald Coase, one of the fathers of new institutional economics, in his the Nobel Prize speech, criticized neoclassical economics for being about, and I quote him, lone individuals exchanging nuts and berries on the edge of a forest. I mean, the Coase is by no means hostile to neoclassical economics, but when it comes to how production is organized, he sees that things is hopeless, because it's about the exchange economy, and it's not even really about the very complex, organized exchange the process happening between firms with very complicated internal division of labor, very complex intra-firm cooperations and competition. Is like lone individuals exchanging nuts and berries. Secondly, in neoclassical theory, the issue surrounding the development of product capabilities is assumed away as it takes these capabilities as given. Take the case of neoclassical trade theory based on this notion of comparative advantage defined by the relative endowments of different the inputs, labor and capital across countries. In this model, countries are only distinguished by the different proportions of capital and labor that they possess. They are all assumed to have the same capabilities to use the same technology. So if they are not, I don't know, I mean, if say Guatemala is not producing BMWs or things like the BMWs, it's not because it cannot, but because it doesn't make economic sense. Because the assumption is that countries are all equal in the abilities to organize and conduct production. The only difference is that they have different combinations of the different inputs, and countries will specialize in the products that use the inputs that they are more abundantly endowed with in more intensive ways. Yeah? So in a way, the neoclassical theory assumes away the very essence of a development problem. Yeah? If you assume that all countries are equally capable of producing the same things, I mean, there's really no the distinction, true distinction between the rich and poor countries. To labor on that BMW example, I mean, even if say the BMW company in Germany gave all its the technical information, drawings and everything to a company in Guatemala, the Guatemala company will not be able to produce BMWs. because that producing things like BMWs that require not just the machines, not just the technical instructions, but the ability to organize complex division of labor within the production system, the ability to kind of generate the necessary the new technology that complement the main technologies, the ability to train the workers to high technical standard. And these are things that cannot be acquired through simple instructions or drawings. Thirdly, believing in the power of the free market, the neoliberal discourse criticizes any attempt to deliberately enhance productive capabilities through public policy intervention, which is really at the heart of the old development thinking, because they think it's at best futile and at worst counterproductive. So neoliberalism is based on economic theory that assumes away the essence of the development the problem, that is the low productive capabilities. It isn't even interested in production itself very much, it being essentially on the economics of market exchange, and it's got the political bias against state intervention. So it's a perfect combination of factors that make it natural for it to ignore the development of productive capabilities. The humanist, led by Amartya Sen, it emerged in the 1980s as a reaction against what was seen as the collectivist materialistic biases of the early development discourse. The early development theories were mainly about transforming the productive structure through policies affecting aggregate variables, like investment, total labor supply, transferring the resources between the rural and the urban areas, and so on. And in applying these theories, individuals were forgotten and were repressed in the name of the greater good called economic development. And this has made the humanists emphasize the need to enhance individual capabilities through health, education, and political and social empowerment. And these are reflected in the MDGs. Thirdly, the discourse of post-industrialism, or discourse of post-industrial knowledge economy. I mean, this idea of post-industrial society emerged already in the 70s, but it has become quite popular since the 1990s. And according to this discourse, rising income has brought about the shift of demand towards services, especially knowledge-based services, information technology, finance, consulting, engineering, R&D, design, and so on. And the advocates of this discourse cite cases like Switzerland and Singapore as examples of service-based prosperity. India is also cited as a case of service-based economic success, because it has in the last couple of decades come to specialize in the exports of knowledge-based services. And the issue of productive capabilities development is almost completely ignored in this discourse, as it is implicitly assumed that even the poorest countries possess the capability to compete in services. So, I'm of course exaggerating, but any country can run call centers, but running a car factory is a lot more difficult. But when it is services that matters, and when the manufacturing doesn't matter anymore, that shouldn't be a problem. Now let me examine these discourses one by one. and point out why these discourses, by neglecting the issue of the production, has negatively contributed to our understanding of economic development. First of all, regarding the neoliberal view, there's ample historical evidence showing that the only, not only is industrialization necessary for economic development, but it does not happen automatically through market forces. And indeed, the neoliberal policies have failed to generate economic development in the last 4 decades. And I mean, even if you confine it to the narrowest notion of economic development, that is economic growth, neoliberalism has performed abysmally. You know, the neoliberal economists that have this growth machismo, if you like. So they say, oh, that you know, in order to have faster growth, that we need to ignore the kind of worldly things like the equality and the empowerment and so on. Because that when you have a greater income, you can always choose to, although they usually do not encourage people to choose that, always choose to do those things after you have generated a higher income. But the reality is that the neoliberal policies have failed miserably in terms of generating growth. So if you look at this table, between 1960 and 80, the bad old days of the import substitution industrialization in the developing countries, per capita income in developing countries that grew at about 3% per year. In the next 4 decades of neoliberalism, growth fell quite dramatically. I mean, especially if we focus on the Latin American countries and sub-Saharan African countries, which for various good and bad reasons are most faithfully followed the neoliberal recipes, growth basically has evaporated. You know, Latin American countries used to grow at 3.1% on average. Now their growth rate, when in the last 4 decades, was about 1/4 of that. You know, despite all the criticisms that sub-Saharan African countries were growing at 1.6% per year in the 60s and 70s, in the last 4 decades, growth rate was 0.3%. Yeah, which means that the average income of sub-Saharan African economies today is only about 6% higher than what it was 40 years ago. You know, China grows that much in 6 months. Well, used to, not anymore. But you know, at the height of its growth boom, it is growing at like 12% per year. And this is what neoliberalism has to show for. And of course, that even 2.6% average the growth rate in the last 4 decades is in big part because of super growth of China, which obviously didn't use neoliberal policies. Also, almost all of today's rich countries, including Britain and the US, that we think are countries that have invented free trade and free market, developed by using state intervention like trade protectionism, industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and regulation of foreign direct investments. Sorry, there's something wrong with the formatting here. I don't have time to go into that, but I have written a lot on this subject. My 2002 book, Kicking the Ladder, 2007 book, Bad Samaritans, which is the more popular kind of book. And yeah, I mean, basically with the very few exceptions, today's rich countries that grew on the basis of all these interventionist policies and protectionism that they today recommend developing countries not to use. As for the humanist discourse, their problem is not so much that they are not interested in raising productive capabilities. They are. But the problem is that they want to do it mainly by making individuals more capable through investment in health and education. But as we have, sorry, we haven't reached that part yet. However, there are only so many productive capabilities that can be developed through improvements at the individual level. So, yeah, just suppose that having seen the very unimpressive record of microfinance, you might decide to invest in health and education of the people who are getting the microloans. And indeed, some of the microfinance institutions have provided those inputs. But what have they led to? I mean, maybe they have become a bit better at managing the food stools, the food stalls, I'm sorry, or that become a bit better in organizing their basket weaving business, but it hasn't led to the creation of the internationally competitive viable businesses. So to put it provocatively, what really distinguishes US or Germany on the one hand and the Philippines or Nigeria on the other hand are their Boeings and Volkswagens, not their economists or medical doctors. The world is full of the Filipino medical doctors. A lot of the Nigerian engineers that are driving taxis in London and New York. They have very capable economists, medical doctors, and engineers, but since their capabilities are not collectively organized into productive enterprises, they have collectively and individually very low productive capabilities. So the first thing is that the developments in the productive capabilities mainly occur inside productive enterprises, not at the individual levels. And the developing enterprises is extremely important for that reason. Also, in addition to the development of business enterprises, you need the development of a series of collective institutions that encourage and help different economic actors to work together. So you need to create institutions that ensure that there's the adequate level of collaboration between capital and labor within firms. You need institutions that encourage cooperation among firms within and across sectors. Of course, they need to also compete in the other areas, but there are things that can benefit things that can encourage cooperation that can benefit all the firms. A good example of this is the kind of research and development centers that small and medium-sized enterprises in the same sector own in the countries like Germany and Italy. Research and development, also marketing, international marketing. These are expensive businesses that individual firms find it difficult to finance. So the SMEs in those countries have pooled their resources together to create R&D centers, marketing agencies. So there's the cooperation there, but after that, in creating more interesting products and kind of upgrading their the qualities, there's a fierce competition between these companies. You also need that institutions that encourage productive interaction between government and business. You need institutions that promote industry academia partnership. So you need actually quite a lot of collective institutions, the firm, and all these other institutions that develop collective productive capabilities. And the neglect of these the collective dimensions of productive capabilities is an important gap in the humanist tradition. And as I argue in the paper with Antonio Andreoni, one of the lecturers of APORDE, and Isabel Estevez in the special issue, there is no reason why the humanists tradition cannot incorporate at least some aspects of collective capabilities, but unfortunately it has not been done. And even worse, that is virtually non-existent when it comes to collective productive capabilities. Anyway, let's move on. Now, moving on to the discourse of post-industrial economy. It is true that in the rich economies, the share of services in GDP has increased over the last few decades. But that does not mean that material production is not important anymore. We are actually, in fact, consuming an ever-increasing amount of material goods. And many countries are producing even more material goods than ever in absolute terms. The point is that the rise in the share of services happens mainly because services are becoming relatively more expensive, because the productivity growth in manufacturing is faster. So let me give you an intuitive example. With the amount of course, the inflation-adjusted the money you paid to get a computer, say, 15 years ago, today you can probably buy 4 computers of equal or even greater computing power, because computer production has become so much more productive. And as a result, you probably have 2 rather than just 1 computer. But even with 2 computers, the portion of your income that goes into the buying computer has gone down by half. In contrast, you are probably getting the same number of haircuts that you did 15 years ago, unless you are going bald. And the price of haircut has stayed, has gone up. So the proportion of your income that goes to your haircut is greater than it was 15 years ago. So if you just look at the current proportion of the incomes going to computers and haircut, you think, oh, people are buying more haircuts than computers. But the reality is that you are actually consuming much more computers than before, while your consumption of haircuts is the same. I mean, it's a very simplistic, intuitive example, but basically the point is that the rise in the share of services in output has happened mainly because services are becoming relatively more expensive, not because that we are consuming more services. And indeed, if you control for the changes in relative prices between manufacturing and services, the decline of manufacturing in the rich countries have been far less steep than it appears to be. So there are some examples here. And in some countries, the share of manufacturing has actually risen if you calculate it in the constant prices. US and Switzerland, a little bit, Finland and Sweden, quite a lot. So these are the numbers that suggest that basically a lot of so-called deindustrialization in the rich countries, except in the UK, where the manufacturing sector has basically collapsed, is due to changes in the relative prices between manufacturing and services. Also, a lot of recent productivity growth in service sectors like finance and retail has been illusory. The high productivity growth of the financial sector has been based on dubious asset valuation and has come at a huge cost to the rest of the economy. That they keep creating these bubbles and making the economy crash, and then the consequences are picked up by the rest of the economy through public bailout of financial institutions and the measures to deal with the financial crash. A lot of the increase in retail service productivity, especially in countries like the US and Britain, have been bought by lowering the quality of the retail service itself. So you may be buying things more cheaply, but the service of selling the retail service itself actually has become degraded. So there are fewer sales assistants, which means longer waits. Supermarkets have moved out of town, so you need to spend more time and fuel to drive there. You have to wait longer than before, waiting for deliveries. I mean, that aspect has changed a bit with the COVID pandemic, but basically these retailers have passed on the cost to customers, but then it's recorded as the rising productivity of the retail services. Also, do not forget that most high-value services, finance, engineering, design, consulting, IT services, mainly sell to the manufacturing sector, so they cannot prosper without a strong manufacturing base. I mean, of course, that countries can specialize in those services, but over time, when you do not have a strong manufacturing base, these services are likely to migrate to where manufacturing is moved, because these services require a close and constant interaction between the service provider and the customers. Yes, unfortunately, I don't have time to give you a spiel on the Switzerland, but basically, I'm going to debunk this myth that countries like Switzerland and Singapore represent the post-industrial possibility of the post-industrial prosperity. Unbeknownst to most people, Switzerland and Singapore are actually the two most industrialized economies in the world. On per capita basis, they have the first and the second highest the manufacturing value added per capita. So that this notion that you do not need to have a strong manufacturing sector because you can live off international banking and tourism and consulting services and so on. It is a myth. Also, the case of India needs to be looked at differently. Between 2008 and 16, India recorded service trade surplus equivalent to 1.1% of GDP. Actually, before 2008, it didn't even have surplus in the trade in services. But this the surplus covered only 14% of its merchandise trade deficit. So there's manufacturing plus food and fuel and so on. And this means that unless it increases its service trade surplus by 7 times, which is the impossible proposition, India cannot maintain its current pace of economic development without a serious balance of payments problem. Also, the development of artificial intelligence, although its extent is highly exaggerated, but it will reach a high level in the coming decades. When that happens, the kind of low value services that India has been specializing, such as back offices of banks and airlines, reading MRI scans, low-level IT jobs, these will all migrate back to the rich countries. So actually, India is going to be hit very hard by the coming wave of the technological progress in artificial intelligence. Anyway, let me wind up because we want to have a break and then have a question and the answer and some discussion. Now, I have shown you how the currently dominant trends in the development thinking have made us neglect the production. But you might ask, so what? Why is the problem that we neglect the production? There are quite a few reasons. One is neglect of production and productive capabilities has made a lot of people think that what countries produce to earn their income does not matter. Yeah? So in the 1980s, there was this famous saying among the opponents of industrial policy in the United States, which has since the advent of Joe Biden's government, has been really refocusing and then revamping its industrial policy. The opponents of industrial policy in the US used to say it doesn't matter whether you produce potato chips or microchips. All that matters is how much income you earn. And this kind of attitude has made also a lot of developing countries complacent about their dependence on commodities or cheap assembly. But in the long run, different economic activities give different scope for growth and technological development. And this means that this will significantly affect, this difference will significantly affect the sustainability of their living standards in the long run. Yeah, so I have no problem in that some countries are cashing in on some resource boom in the short run, unless they convert those resource rents into building the higher productive capabilities. The kind of momentarily high standard of living will not be that sustainable. Secondly, the neglect of productive capabilities has meant that our assessment for policies have acquired short-term biases, because if you don't think about if you don't take the production and productive capability seriously, you are going to have a negative view on policies that reduce current consumption with a view to increasing long-term productive capabilities, such as infant industry protection or policies to deliberately increase investment through public policy intervention. Of course, these policies can also fail, but these policies have been categorically rejected because we are not taking production seriously. Thirdly, the collective dimension of productive capabilities and productive development, the collective, especially the collective dimension of productive development is neglected, making people ignore the issue of how to develop modern firms and other supportive institutions. Of course, there's a lot of talk of private sector development, improving the business environment and all that. But it's very negative agenda in the sense that it's all about government getting out of the way. So deregulation, cutting taxes, privatization. Unfortunately, these measures are not going to automatically lead to enterprise development, because industry after industry, country after country have shown that firms need to be actively helped to develop their capabilities. They need public R&D or R&D subsidies. They could be given public consulting services, especially small and medium-sized enterprises. Worker training programs could be run or subsidized by the government. The government could encourage industry association so that enterprises could cooperate with each other better. And even at the individual level, the neglect of production has all led to a very partial view of our individual well-being, because neoclassical economics and humanist discourse see people as consumers, only consumers rather than producers, which means that issues of employment, quality of jobs, workplace welfare, all of these have been ignored as a result, because all that matters is what you get as individual consumers. Yeah, of course, there's the income, maybe education, healthcare, but then the other very important aspect of your life, work and employment, these are completely ignored. Okay, so to wind up, sorry, it keeps going wrong. I argue that we need to incorporate the insights from the humanist tradition and pay greater attention to the non-material aspect of development, like freedom, equality, solidarity, and community. I totally buy into that aspect of the humanist tradition, but we need to treat individuals not just as consumers, as in neoliberal economics, nor just as citizens with entitlements, as in the humanist approach, but also as producers in whose life, employment, and the contents of their work are very important dimensions. Also, our understanding of production itself needs to be improved, with attention paid not just to technologies, but also to organizations, institutions, culture, and even politics. Oops. Last but not least, environmental sustainability has to be incorporated. Contrary to what a lot of people think, development of productive capabilities, especially in the manufacturing sector, is crucial in preventing and adapting to climate change. Unless we can find ways to produce fertilizers and steel and so without using fossil fuel, we are not going to move away from the fossil fuel economy unless we develop all these technological and organizational capabilities. Countries cannot even cope with the consequences of climate change. It's not about climate change, but a very telling example is that back in 2010, Haiti, which had a big earthquake, and at least 100,000, possibly 200,000 people were killed in that earthquake. And sorry, but that earthquake was only level 7 according to the Richter scale. Yeah? I mean, with that kind of earthquake, probably 5 to 10 people die in Japan, because the Japanese have developed all these technologies to make the buildings the earthquake proof. Of course, if you get hit by Richter scale 8 or 9, like Japan was several years ago in the famous Fukushima earthquake, even those that cannot survive. But you know, Japan has all those technologies to protect people from earthquake. They have the organizational power to evacuate people in time and all that. So the same scale of natural disaster, Richter scale 7 earthquake, kills 10 people in one country and 100,000, 200,000 in another. Yeah? So it's not about climate change, but that you can see that my point. Yeah. And in the effort to kind of increase our environmental sustainability, the rich countries need to further develop their productive capabilities, if not necessarily in the area of material consumption, which really needs to be reduced for these countries, because the developing countries have the low capabilities to develop green technologies, both to reduce the greenhouse gases and to deal with the consequences of climate change. So I'm not saying that in emphasizing the importance of production and productive capabilities, we can just dust off the books by, I don't know, Albert Hirschman or Simon Kuznets, and go back to the 1960s. There are all this updating and the upgrading that needs to be done with the what I call the productionist discourse. But that discourse needs to be brought back. That needs the discourse needs to be at the center of development discourse if you are going to build the truly sustainable prosperity in more than a handful of the countries that are enjoying high standard of living these days. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to stop my presentation.